Hello, welcome to another English language A-level video with me, Paul. This one is another video about world Englishes. So we're going to be looking at some of the distinctive forms of different Englishes around the world. And we're also going to be thinking about the future. So what does the future hold for this language? Let's start off with a text from Nicaragua. Do you know where Nicaragua is? Yes, well done. So Nicaragua is in Central America. It's between Costa Rica and Honduras, I believe, the Mosquito Coast. And it has something like 30 to 50,000 speakers of this language. Now, this is a Creole language, so this is a fully elaborate language that was spawned from a pidgin English. Okay, and here we have a set of instructions. And it's a set of instructions for a water filter. So let's have a go at reading the beginning of it and try and sort of identify some of the non-standard features, non-standard from our point of view as a British standard English speaker. Water with filter, good water for drink every day. So we're noticing here the phonetic nature of the spelling, so we can really hear the sound of this language. Water with filter, so I'm noticing here the use of this connective. It's putting with between the water and the filter, and we wouldn't normally have that in standard British English. Okay, so good water for drink, and we have the omission there of the ing, the progressive aspect of the verb, every day. And then we've got an instruction over here, follow the step dem good for the use a the filter. So follow these steps well to use the filter. I'm noticing all sorts of things. So I'm noticing substitution phonologically. So instead of the th fricative sound, the, in the definite article, consistently through there, it's doing it as a plosive sound, duh, like that. That's very common across the world. Okay, because in many native languages, that fricative th sound, th or th, doesn't exist. Okay, I'm also noticing the use of the plural form here. So the noun doesn't have a s inflection on the end, but in its place, it's got dem, them. So it's the third person plural object pronoun that's put on there. So that is a consistent way all the way through this in order to construct a plural form. So it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's not following a rule of standard British English, but it is following a rule because it's consistent. Okay, and I'm noticing this word good. So in standard British English, I think we would be using the adverb well, follow the steps, well. I'm also noticing here, a bit like I said, well, there's an extra word on with here. I'm noticing the accumulation of all those words there, where I think in British Standard English, you would just say to filter, whereas here it says for the use a the filter. Okay, we'll just have a look at the first three sets of instructions, if we can try and work out what they say. Wash your hand dem good. So the dem there doesn't mean damn, it means them. So it's the plural form. So wash your hands well. Notice the absence then of the S inflection on the end of hand. Second instruction, wash the bucket and the cover dem good with chlorinated water and, or I should say, boiled water and soap. So it took me a bit of time to work out that that must mean boiled because of its phonetic spelling and also the absence of the ed inflection on the end. Number three, wash the filter with a brush and rinse off with clean water. So notice that like the spelling of clean there is giving you a really good indication of the pronunciation of all of the different syllables of the word. Watch out! Never wash the filter with chlorine or soap. There you go. So there's a really good example of a particular Creole form of English. Now the debate, of course, is, what's going to happen to English? Is English going to separate out? So different people in different parts of the world are going to, a bit like Latin, sort of fragmented and broke down into Italian and Spanish and Portuguese and all of those Romance languages. Is the same thing going to be happening to English, where in 100 years' time, 200 years' time, people who are speaking English, it's going to be mutually unintelligible. It's a bit like, for example, the William Caxton text that we looked on a previous video, where, you know, two people from different parts of the country, they couldn't agree on using the same word for eggs, eiren, eggs. So is it going to be like that, where English is actually going to break down? Okay, we'll discuss that a little bit further in the back end of this video. For the time being, let's have a look at some lexical examples of World English. Let's travel the world and listen in to some of the characteristic vocabulary choices in different parts of the world for English. Jamaica, give to that peel-head gentleman at the back. West Africa, Botswana is famous for its bushmeat. African English, the bus driver removed his chewing stick and pulled up the handbrake. Indian English, don't forget your key bunch on the table. Lankan English, that's Sri Lanka, a basket woman arrived at the station. Finally, the Philippines, the venue was taken over by Hihat. Pause the video there, try and work out what these bits of vocabulary mean. Should we look through them one by one? So let's look at this one, this piece of Caribbean English. This is from Jamaica. Give it to that peel-head gentleman at the back. Now, peel-head means bald-headed. Okay, we've got a bit of compounding that's going on, the word peel and the word head. So it's a solid compound. And peel, well, it's using a metaphor, isn't it? Like fruit peel. So presumably it's from that semantic field. And also, presumably, this is a word that has ameliorated, because a word that possibly was an insult to start with has acquired a more affectionate kind of meaning. It's ameliorated over time to acquire more positive meanings. Nothing wrong with being peel-headed, I say. There's your first one. Botswana is famous for its bushmeat, they say. Bushmeat? Well, bushmeat is game. So we're talking about wild mammals or birds that are hunted for sport or food. Another example of compounding, another solid compound. But look at this, it's evidence of semantic broadening as well. They take that word bush. Now, in British Standard English, a bush is a shrub or a clump of shrubs, just moderate length. You know, you have bushes in your garden. Whereas a bush in African English, and indeed in Australian English, is wild or uncultivated country. So the word is polysemous. You know, it means different things in different parts of the world. Polysemy. Move on. After eating nuts, I always use a chewing stick. Well, chewing stick means a toothpick. Okay. So you might be forgiven of thinking, oh, well, that must mean chewing gum. But no, it's a chewing stick. So it's a device that you use, a little tiny stick, to dislodge bits of fruit that have got stuck in your teeth. Okay, a chewing stick. A key bunch was found in a cafe. We're in India now. So key bunch means bunch of keys. Excuse me while I turn the light on. So a bunch of keys. The grammar word has been omitted. So, you know, our word of, the preposition of, that's been omitted. Notice the inversion of the noun. And again, it's all about compounding. So in this case, it's a hyphenated compound. Key bunch. We then have basket woman. Remove that basket woman from the shop. So this is Sri Lanka, huge island south of India. So my dictionary definition of basket woman is a coarsely behaved woman. So, and yet another example of compounding. So here, basket, well, it's being used as a metonym. Now, metonym is one of these words where an image stands for an idea. Okay, it's a bit like the crown or the throne represents royalty and monarchy. So basket here is a metonym. And I suppose encoded in this, like in all language, you've got social attitudes, haven't you? So a slightly negative representation of a social group. And finally, in terms of vocabulary, that's Hihat. Always ignores me. You might hear this on the streets of Manila. So a Hihat means, well, a snob. So notice the sound of the word. So you've got alliteration here. The H's at the beginnings of the word. Those are aspirant phonemes. So the aspirant alliteration conveys the idea of, well, social pretension. And again, it's a metonym, isn't it? Because you've got your visual image and it symbolises an idea. It's very akin to the 18th century idea of a bigwig. That, you know, if you had status and standing in 18th century Britain, then you were allowed to walk around with a huge wig. Okay, a high hat. Okay, so we talked about some of those distinctive lexical features. Now let's travel the world in terms of grammar. We'll go to India, Africa, Malaysia, Singapore, etc. Up to 12 years of schooling. I am on scholarship. My mother, he live in Kampong. Every microcosm consists of many cells. My wife, she passed her exam. She is knowing her science very well. Don't eat so much sweets. I'm going to voice out my opinion. Okay, let's try and deconstruct this in terms of grammar. So up to 12 years of schooling. We're hearing this in Indian English. So this is a very common feature of all sorts of world Englishes where we have the absence of the S plural marker. We saw it on the Nicaraguan Kroll instructions, didn't we? So the absence of the S plural marker from the noun year. But look, you've got a determiner here. So you've got this word 12, and that shows plurality. So I suppose the argument would go, well, you know, the absence of this inflectional ending doesn't lead to ambiguity because we know it's a plural concept. I am not on scholarship. So British Standard English, of course, would be I'm not on a scholarship. So we would have an indefinite article. So this is very common in all sorts of world Englishes. Maybe the speakers of those languages in their native tongue, they use articles in different ways. Maybe they don't have articles in those languages, or maybe they're just different. So here we've got the omission of the indefinite article. So that's a grammar word. And remember that when we speak, we habitually miss out all sorts of grammar words anyway. You know, it's a normal part of conversational ellipsis. So this could very well be interference from the speaker's native language. My mother, he live in Kampong. This is from Malaysia. So British Standard English, my mother lives in Kampong. So we've got double subjects here. So we've got two nominalised forms. We've got the mother here, and then we've got the third person singular subject pronoun. Okay, so one of those would be considered redundant in British Standard English. We also have a bit of a gender mismatch, because that seems to be female and that male, so we've got that. And also, look at the verb. So we've got the omission of the third person present simple S inflection. Does that impact on meaning? Not in the least. Okay, so that S that you put on the end of the present simple form of the verb, it actually doesn't link in with meanings at all. Maybe over time, as more and more people speak world Englishes, maybe that S inflection will drop away in the same way as other inflections in the language over the centuries have previously dropped away. What thinkest thou? Okay, my wife, she passed her exam. So this is from Singapore. So Standard English, my wife passed her exam. And again, we've got this double stating of the subject because we've got the wife and we've got this third person subject pronoun she. So this is a common feature of informal spoken conversation, isn't it? It's the sort of thing that you and I do all the time when we are saying anecdotes. And notice also how the ed inflection has been omitted. Actually, the tense can be inferred from the context. It's pretty obvious that this must be a past tense meaning. She is knowing her science very well. Now, this is the sort of thing that we mentioned when we were talking about Indian English, because know here is a mental verb. It's a mental or stative verb. Now, it so happens that in British Standard English, you don't tend to use the progressive aspect of the verb when you're using mental verbs. Not the case here. She is knowing her science very well, rather than she knows her science very well. Okay, that's a particular feature of all sorts of world Englishes, and particularly in Indian English, you get that a lot. Don't eat so much sweets. I'll remember that. That's Singaporean English. So standard English in Britain don't eat so many sweets. This is again about determiners. We have two kinds here. We have much and we have many. And we use the word many when it's a count noun, something that you can count. Whereas we use much if it's a non-count noun. Now, sweets for us are definitely countable. So in British Standard English, you'd say many. And again, this could be interference from speakers' native language, which may not differentiate between those determiners. Finally, on this one, in terms of grammar, I'm going to voice out my opinion. So in British Standard English, you'd just say, I'm going to voice my opinion. So this is being used as a what's called a prepositional or phrasal verb, where you have a verb and then you plonk a preposition after it. Okay, so in Standard British English, the out, the preposition, would be considered redundant. Okay, let's have a think about some of the things that are spoken about in the A2A textbook about attitudes towards World English, and particularly this notion that is there a problem with English being so dominant across the world? I mean, some people argue that English is actually a great force for good. It's a unifying language. It creates global communication. It means that people can communicate with each other from completely different parts of the world. It's comprehensible, it's accessible, and it's usable. And the fact that it's so prevalent in culture, on the internet, on the TV, etc., means that everybody has a share, an equal share in this language. On the other hand, many people react against the authority that places on British and American English standards because it privileges British and American users of the language, who are seen as the kind of gatekeepers of culture. And Robert Phillipson comes along in the early 1990s and argues that actually the spread of English as a global language disadvantages other languages, and what that means is that they have a loss of status and prestige, and they could well die out. So for many people, English is actually a language killer. And we've seen that, of course, in the British Isles itself. You think of, languages like the Cornish language, for example, that used to be spoken in the southwest of the country. Or you think of sort of Gaelic Scottish or Gaelic Irish. Relatively few speakers of those languages now. And people think, well, that's a great shame, because when you lose a language, you lose part of the culture and identity of its speakers. Okay, so now we are going to gaze into the future and think about the future of English, which is never going to be easy, is it? I mean, language is inherently messy, it's complex, and it's pretty unpredictable. So who can confidently predict how English is going to be looking and sounding in 100 years' time, 500 years' time? I mean, one thing's for sure, English will change. It will continue to change in the future. Okay, but will it improve? Will it degenerate? Well, many people would argue that language does neither. It just changes. It doesn't particularly get better. It doesn't get worse. All it does, it responds to social needs. There are some great videos, as you'd expect, on YouTube about this. That's quite a nice one. What will English language look like in the future? That's a 5-minute video. This is quite a nice one as well. What will future English be like? I'd recommend that you have a look on those. Let's run through some of the arguments here. So the future. So some people think, well, English, it's going to become more uniform. It's going to become more homogeneous and standardized. And that process is helped by all those countries in the world which seem to have adopted English as their official language. There are something like 75 languages in the world out of 195 in which English is the dominant language. So maybe this is the future, that we're going to have more and more people in the world, of the 7.5 billion people in the world, they're going to be speaking English. And what form of English is that going to be? Well, it's more likely to be American English than British English, you can bet that, because American English is fast becoming this kind of world standard. And that's because of the cultural power of American English. We hear it on films, we hear it on music, we see it in brands, it's on the telly, it's across the internet, etc. So what you've got here perhaps is the process of dialect leveling. In previous videos, we've looked at how accents and some traditional accents and dialects in the British Isles are leveling out. Well, it's probably the same with language in terms of American English. Okay. And of course, communication technology might aid that process. So we're talking about mobiles and the internet. It actually might make English more uniform. There used to be a stat floating around some years ago that 80% of the information stored on computers worldwide are in English. Now, I don't know whether that remains the case, whether the figure is higher or lower than that, but that's a pretty astonishing dominance of English. And think about how technology also will help English become more standardized as well, because you've got computer software which routinely uses American spelling patterns. It's going to be spelling C-O-L-O-R, and if you spell it in a non-standard way, or even in a British way, O-U-R, it's going to put a nasty little red line underneath it to say, change that with you, we want the American spelling. And indeed, if we're thinking about spell checks on computers, maybe the fact that we're all spending more time tapping away on our computers rather than handwriting means that in schooling there is going to be less emphasis placed on teaching spelling. Because if the software changes it for you, why learn all these intricate spellings? And whilst we're on the subject of technology affecting graphology, how about the internet and mobile phone communication, the impact on punctuation? Because when we're texting, if we're using, let's say, fewer and fewer capital letters, then surely that's going to bleed over into other forms of English that we're using. So certain punctuation rules might die out. I'm thinking about the poor old apostrophe of possession, for example, or the semicolon, maybe. How many of us are going to be using those sorts of forms in 30, 50, 100 years' time? Okay, so we could have this spread of English, but on the other hand, English might actually just become more broken up. It might become more diverse, and as I mentioned before, the same process might happen to it of fragmentation as happened to Latin, splitting into those Romance languages. Okay, and it could well be that these separate varieties like Indian English, Singaporean English, Zimbabwean English could become ways of actually displaying national identity and national independence. And in spawning their own forms, what they're doing is they're rejecting the sort of cultural imperialism of countries like the USA and the UK. Okay, so those localized standard forms like Indian English might emerge as kind of like the official language of that country. And indeed, countries like India and China, they may challenge the US's power, and in the future, American English might not be considered as useful, let's say, as Mandarin Chinese, which is, after all, the native language of something like 800 million people on the planet. Okay, so the other thing on the future of English is that actually English might stop dominating the internet. Okay, because if you get the growth of online translation software, as that improves further and further, then it becomes less important to learn American or British English. And clearly in the future, other countries like India and China, they are likely to have more of an impact on those fields of science and technology, and that could well lead to the loss of importance of English. So the other thing that might happen is that standard forms may become more uniform, while regional varieties might become more diverse. Bi-dialectism, that's what that's called, bi-dialectism. So, for example, a Nigerian business executive, well, they might use a regional form of Nigerian English when they're speaking informally with local customers, but they might well use a more standardized American English form when they're with their international customers. So the future is uncertain, and it would be unwise to be too dogmatic about confidently asserting the future of English. We don't know what's going to happen because language changes with social history. And finally, here I'm just going to show you some typical sorts of language change questions in which you might incorporate your knowledge and understanding about the future of English and world Englishes. Here we go. Evaluate the idea that English users around the world are changing the nature of the language. That's a great question. Evaluate the idea that British English is different and superior to other world Englishes. Controversial. Evaluate the idea that the emergence of new Englishes is good for the language. And finally, evaluate the idea that English is changing and fragmenting into different Englishes. They're great questions. You can draw upon your historical knowledge of language change over the century, over previous centuries, but you can also think about what's happening to English around the world. You can draw upon the kinds of examples which we've looked at today about, the creolization and those lexical and grammatical examples from those different places in the world. You can draw upon the models of English that we talked about in a previous video. Schneider's, post-colonial Englishes, and Catchrew and MacArthur. So there's plenty for you to be getting your teeth into. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed learning about global English.